some ideas and inspiration. We have got for you the best of the best. I can really say that. Fazzy Wayne is a global diversity and inclusion strategist and has extensive experience in community development and social justice as a speaker, trainer, consultant, facilitator and activist. Fazzy is a skilled facilitator in the areas of unconscious bias, gender inequality and racial socialisation and identity. As the founder and director of the Wayne Group, her work focuses on capacity building, leadership development and addressing the systemic barriers that are held towards historically undermined groups to achieve social impact. I love that. I want to hear more. Please give a really warm welcome to Fazzy Wayne. Good morning, everyone. This is going to be a challenge for me because I normally don't talk in one place, but because they're recording, I'm going to have to try and stand still. And I think that goes from years of being a mother to teenage boys. But good morning and thank you all, and especially to Nikki and Alicia for inviting me this morning. I'd like to start by paying my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. I would particularly like to acknowledge the sacrifices they have made so that people like me can actually call Australia home. I think that when we acknowledge traditions and realize that all of us are actually standing on those who've gone before us, it actually paves the way for great conversation. So I'm really delighted that I'm able to speak this morning, and it's great seeing my friend Ingrid as well. So I'm looking forward to hearing her. Now I have 25 minutes to pretty much go through what I normally do in 2 days. So I'm going to try and make it interesting because this topic is actually quite complex. And I say that because I think we need to go back to the basics of what exactly are we talking about when we talk about cultural diversity. And I think that a lot of the times our terminology probably dictates the path in which we actually go. And when we don't have a clear understanding of what that means, then it means that we'll probably get ourselves into situations where we are constantly trying to redefine or create programs and structures to actually help us achieve that. And so I'd like to start with just asking you all, when I say the word culture, what are some of the words that come to mind for you? Customs, yes. Anything else?
Rituals.
Rituals?
Beliefs.
Beliefs?
The way we do things.
The way we do things? Anything else?
Lifestyle.
Identity? Sorry?
Lifestyle.
Sorry?
Lifestyle.
Leaf-style.
Lifestyle.
Lifestyle.
Now there's diversity. Different culture.
Yeah.
Maybe the way in which you were raised, your upbringing.
Yes, so your background and upbringing.
Ever evolving.
Ever evolving. Let's take it a step further. What about if I asked you what comes to mind when I say Australian culture?
Beer.
Yeah.
Wow.
Barbecue.
Barbecue.
A fair go.
Fair go.
Mateship.
Mateship.
European.
European.
She'll be right, mate.
You'll be right, mate. Yeah.
Freedom.
Freedom. Define that a little bit for me.
I guess the feeling of safety.
The feeling of safety. Okay. All right. So as you can see, it's interesting that when you think about the word, excuse me, culture on its own, there's a few different words that came up when I specifically asked about the Australian culture. And all of those things, depending on where you're coming from, really do make up any culture. So and I guess when we think about culture, when we think about the way we do things, when we think about whether it's in an organization, whether it's a group of people, whether it's language, whether it's race All of those things pretty much make up a culture. But when we think about cultural diversity, I guess the question that we need to ask is exactly what is it that we're trying to achieve? And so the reason why I started by asking you that was because I wanted to get a sense of, is there a difference when you're asked the word culture and then Australian culture? Are there going to be any words that will be similar? Because if we're defining culture broadly and saying it's the beliefs and the systems, do we have any similarities? And it's also interesting that within the Australian cultural context, multiculturalism or Aboriginal were two words that were not shared. And those, and often, it happens every time I go somewhere and I ask, those are two words that are not spoken, or people don't automatically come up with that. And yet, I think that they make up a lot of the Australian cultural fabric because we talk a lot about it. And being from community service organizations, a lot of the times our programs and our services are geared towards engaging with those different community groups. And the reason why I say that is it's so important for us to understand the history in the context that we all operate in. And I think that we can do more as individuals, as communities, and as corporations to truly understand the history of Australia. And so for me, I look forward to a day when I will go somewhere and I ask what's the Australian culture, and the first thing that somebody will say is Aboriginal, or bring a lot of that in, because it is really the foundation for all of us being here. Now, what I would like you to do is, I would like to introduce you to what I call the 3 C's. And the 3 C's are basically a way of, defining your cultural and identity, or your cultural background. And so the 3 C's it's an exercise that I usually write when we do the courageous conversations about race training. And the 3 C's are built on the country, which is nationality, your culture or ethnicity, and your color or your racial makeup. So I'd like you to just take a few seconds to come up with your 3 C's. So that's the country, second is your culture, and third is color. So what is your nationality, what is your ethnicity, and what is your racial makeup? So share that with a friend.
Can you
3
talk
C's.
about country of birth or country that you've not?
So it can be, it depends on how you see that, because for people it will be different. So I don't want to dictate to you what it is. discussion and conversation. And sometimes it's a question that you probably haven't actually thought about, and so you start thinking about it. But any volunteers of the 3 C's?
I've been volunteered. We had a conversation about, we didn't get past the first C because we found it very hard to articulate, and JR was saying often your vocation gets put into a box, and similarly country or culture does. So we really just determined that it can't be defined in 3 C's because it's about how you feel and what you say and what you do and what you eat and who you are, and it changes. So yeah, we just kind of opened it up rather than closing it down.
Oh, she's good.
So well done. If I ask you then, if I said, if you took the definition that country was either birthplace or where you have citizenship, and then culture was anything that you identify with in terms of ethnicity, and color could be just the color of your skin, what would you say to that?
As an individual, England and Australia are my countries. Culture, I still couldn't really define. It's just too broad for me. And the colour of my skin, I guess, colloquially white.
Okay. Anyone else?
Country is Yunga for me. Yeah, I've got the second one.
Culture.
Culture is Yunga. But Australia, culture, I more strongly identify with my Yunga culture because it's there, it's real, it's tangible. I connect to it. But there's plenty of other cultures I connect to, so the footy culture. The Frio culture, love it. So there's many different cultures I connect to, but I guess my strongest is Yunga. And the colour of my skin, for me, I've always been taught it's not about the colour of your skin, but the content of your character. So that's a hard one for me to answer, but I would say a caramel latte eventually.
Anyone else? So pretty much you had quite a lot of discussion, and as we've heard, there's also been a lot of maybe difficulty or challenges in terms of defining the 3 C's. Yet, when we talk about cultural diversity, when we talk about diversity, isn't that what we do though? We try and define it before we actually give people the opportunity to actually define what that means. And so then I pose the question to you, then what is cultural diversity? So being leaders within the community services sector, where we're talking about wanting to increase cultural diversity at a board or senior management level, or really examine that. If we in the room are having difficulties in even defining what that is, then what exactly are we looking for? Is a question that I would like to pose to you. So it goes back to exactly what I started off by saying, is that unless we actually get the definitions or terminology correct, or at least have a shared understanding of what we are looking for, then is it possible, perhaps, that there will be on our boards or in our organizations various definitions of what culture could look like, and therefore we will have different people that we deem to have a cultural makeup that we want, and probably all come from different angles. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is, just as you found it difficult to define your 3 C's, a lot of the times that's exactly what we're expecting people to do. When we implement programs, we come up with what the 3 C's should look like, and then we try and implement those programs. Or we come up with 3 C's of our target client group or target organizations, and then that's what we go for. And unfortunately, what's happened is we now have a situation where the figures, when we talk about cultural diversity, and I think that when we do talk about cultural diversity within the Australian context, and I'm only making an assumption based on the literature and the things that have been written, is that what we're basically saying is we want to see an increase in people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. A term that I absolutely hate, but I have no choice but using all the time because that's exactly what's there. I really don't understand what culturally and linguistically diverse means, purely because I think all of us are culturally and linguistically diverse. I really do. And so for me to be put in a box and say, okay, you're culled, I don't know what that means, because everybody, as far as I'm concerned, is culled. And you saw from the exercise that you couldn't even come up with what culture is because you've got aspects of culture. So just to give you a bit of context, I will give you what I call my racial autobiography. A lot of people are probably wondering, who am I or where do I come from? So I was born in Zimbabwe, and my parents went to the States when I was very little. This was before Zimbabwe got independence, and so they met when they were pretty young. So my dad finished high school in the States, went on to university, and so I did all my primary schooling in the States, and then we moved back to Zimbabwe, and then I started working in the telecommunications sector when mobile phones were not even a thing in Africa. And so I worked for an organization that introduced mobile phones, and so it was quite interesting trying to teach the president and all the ministers how to use a mobile phone when you've got a guard with a gun making sure that you're teaching them the right things. And that took me to another country in Botswana, where I stayed for 8 years. I then moved to England and lived there for 2 years, and then moved to Australia 10 years ago. So when you ask me to define culture, I don't know where to start. Because when I went back to Zimbabwe, I couldn't speak Shona. I spoke with an American accent, and I never really, I wasn't black enough to be, Zimbabwean, and I wasn't white. So I was just that kid that was roaming around. The color of my skin said I was black, but the cultural beliefs, the language, and my mannerisms were American. And I came to Australia, and the first thing that I was asked is, you must be really happy that you're here. You must have escaped. And I thought, where am I escaping from? And then I realized that people had made an assumption that I was a refugee or asylum seeker. And so that was even more training to say, not everyone who comes to Australia who is a person of color is actually a refugee. Some of us actually came on migrant visas, and we are professionals. But then that's a teaching for another day. But I'm just giving you context in terms of the journey. And so until we actually understand the makeup of what diversity is, we're going to have a problem in terms of defining what cultural diversity on our boards or senior management would look like. I do have a few suggestions, however, of what that could look like. But that's just to give you context in which, just my background and how I grew up, and, some of the things that I perceive to be my culture. So if I was asked to define the 3 C's, my country would be Australian, because that's where I have nationality for intents and purposes. I would say my culture is probably Zimbabwean stroke, American stroke, Shona stroke, whatever I'm feeling on that particular day. It usually depends on which continent I'm in, to be honest. And my race is black, brown, person of color, whatever terminology, because it is a lie for people to say they don't see color, because the first thing that you should see is my color. And what I want people to understand is that there's nothing wrong with seeing color. So we have to get away from this thing of, I'm colorblind. No, don't be colorblind. See color, appreciate color, because when we appreciate difference, we'll be able to actually take a step further. It's when we block that out and say, well, I don't see your color. And I understand what people mean by that. What they mean is they're not judging me, or they're not treating me differently based on my color. And I think we can say that. It's okay to actually say that. But what is not okay for me personally is when people tell me they don't see me, because if you don't see me, then I feel invisible. And that's me speaking from a personal perspective. So when we think about the business case for diversity, we all should know it by now. We've spoken a lot about the business case. We know that in terms of decision making, we get a diversity of thought. We know that it increases performance. We know that there's lower turnover. There's a lot of research that's been done in terms of the business case for diversity. And unfortunately, even that term diversity in the Australian context, it's focused more on gender. And yet diversity is so many different things. We're talking about, you know, sexuality, we're talking about age, we're talking about, you know, racial makeup and the culture and those ethnicities. And I wish that we could actually look at diversity and promote diversity in all its fullness and not just a section of it. And that's why it's important, I suppose, for us to be able to define. So what are the things that I would love to see? I would love to see what I would call probably a culturally and racially diverse board. And I don't say that term to offend people, but I think that we need to understand that there's a difference between race and racism. So race, if we're looking at it from a purely the color of someone's skin or how they look, there's nothing wrong. Race is neither negative or positive. It's just who we are. Racism is something else. So when I say racially diverse, I'm not talking about racism. What I'm saying is that we would benefit if we had a racially and culturally diverse board or management. Why? When we think about the community services sector, a lot of our engagement is for people who are from those groups. And so it would be of benefit to us to be able to engage and actually have some of them there. Now, how do we do that is probably what you're asking. And I think that the how basically looks at us changing our systems. So there's three things that we probably need to look at in any organization. And I think the first is our people. So what does the leadership look like? Who are our people? What's the makeup of that? Those are things that we need to look at. We need to look at our systems. What are the policies and procedures that we have in place in an organization to be able to tackle this? And what is the culture that we're thinking about? And one of the things that I feel that you could do is, first of all, we have to realize, I think, that all of us are guilty of unconscious bias. We all have it. Whether it's gender, whether it's race, whatever it is, we all have unconscious bias. And I think the reason why the makeup of our boards, the makeup of our organizations, where we don't have a lot of diversity in those areas is because of unconscious bias, primarily. There could be other issues at play, but I think primarily it's about unconscious bias. So as an organization, I think the first thing that I would suggest that you tackle is you tackle the area of unconscious bias. And how do you do that? Well, you have to do training. You have to, allow professional development opportunities to be able to tackle that. Try and identify, because remember that unconscious bias, every one of us will have it. And if we are able to have the tools to be able to recognize it, identify it, it's a step further in us moving towards something, you know? And so I think that's the first key is to look at that. We also need courageous leaders. We need leaders who are able to call things the way they are and not be afraid to do that. If you're thinking of changing a culture in any organization, you've got to be able to truly identify what the issues are. So I think it starts with that. And I did training for a large mining and civil construction company a couple of weeks ago who are wanting to increase women in their management and board level. And this is their two divisions had 7 and 8% women across the whole of Australia. Very low figures, but you know, we did an unconscious bias session, and it was interesting to see the things that came up for them as leaders in organizations where they felt that they were doing the right thing, but they were able to identify that. And I think that it's a bottom up and a top down. So if we start with the leadership and identify what are some of those biases, what are some of those challenges and barriers that we have, I think that will be a step in the right direction. And also I think we need to think about, you know, do we have any accountability or targets in place? Do we have anything in our organizations that says that we need to increase that? And maybe that's a discussion that you could be thinking about is, you know, how do we do that? How do we, and one of the things that they said to me that was really powerful was that they said that unfortunately, as much as we hate this whole debate on targets and quotas, increasing women is not going to happen organically because we have a culture where they just haven't been there. And so for us to expect that to happen, it's not going to happen. So we have to sort of intervene. And the way we'll intervene is by doing targets. And so I'd like to say to you, if increasing your cultural diversity is not going to happen organically, then you might have to intervene and sort of speed the process along. And you could do that by setting targets. And I think the Australian Bureau of Statistics has some key indicators that you can use in terms of how do you capture, the cultural diversity in your organization, and that could be a start of doing that. So measuring that, what does your organization look like, would be a good place to start. Another thing is probably thinking about, when we think about inclusive leadership and promoting that, what does inclusive leadership look like? And I think that then goes back to the very beginning of what I started sharing on, is defining what does that mean? What is inclusive leadership? So what does it look like for our organization? What should it look like for our organization? And I find that sometimes when you engage with your stakeholders and your community, you're able to get some of those answers. I think historically what has happened is we have community consultations, or we have these stakeholder events where we get information from whichever target group we want. So for example, the culturally and linguistically diverse, and we'll ask them, what do you want? But then we go away and then we create the program, and they're not there at the creation, they're there to input. So maybe we need to change that and say, maybe CALD people know how CALD people need to be treated. Maybe CALD people have the policies and procedures they feel would work for their community. Maybe that's just a thought, that's just a maybe. But we could probably start by thinking about things like that. And so that then allows us to look at our systems, it allows us to look at our leadership, and it also allows us to think about how do we change culture. And fortunately, there is something that can help you. The Australian Human Rights Commission just released a book, and it was, I think the Human Rights Commissioner had a reference group made up of representatives from Telstra, PwC, and Sydney Business School and Westpac, and they've come up with a booklet that should be able to help, and it actually talks about increasing cultural diversity and what inclusive leadership looks like. I'm not sure if the booklet is available at the moment, but that could be a resource that I think could help, because the reality is we talk about the community services sector, but the community services sector and the ASX companies are pretty much the same when we look at cultural diversity. And so I go back to the point of, perhaps what is missing is the fact that we need to probably become more diverse in our thinking, as somebody shared on my table. Maybe that's where the problem is. Because if the community services sector and ASX companies are pretty much the same when we look at cultural diversity, then that means that it's not a sector problem. It's probably more ingrained, it's probably in the systems. And so how do we change those systems? Well, the only way I think that we can start is we first of all change ourselves. And so that's where we have to identify our bias, because over time we actually become the system. And so what I would propose is that when we think about cultural identity or cultural background, that we actually consider both. When we are thinking about cultural diversity, that we think of both. How does somebody culturally identify, and what is their cultural background? And probably start to see changes in what our senior management and board look like. And it's just like when you think of the melting pot example, which I honestly hate when they talk about being a melting pot. We don't want to become a melting pot. We want to be like a salad where we retain every single flavor. We don't want it to be mixed. We want the lettuce to remain lettuce. We want the tomato to be a tomato. We want the onion. And when we can serve a salad of diversity where we're able to identify and say, wow, there's a tomato, there's a piece of onion, there's a lettuce, I think that's when we truly will have cultural diversity. Now, like I did say at the beginning, I was not able to help you in 25 minutes, but I do have courses that can help you, and I do have training that can help you that looks at in-depth systems at a cultural level, and I'm sure there's other people who do that. But this is just to give you some thought. But what I would like to ask you is, I would like each of you to write down your takeaway of what you're actually going to do when you go back to work. Are you going to look at your culture of your organization? Are you going to look at the people? Are you going to look at the systems? That should be a takeaway, and I hope that when you go there, I'm going to give you 10 seconds to write your takeaway. When you go back to work, what is the one thing that you're going to do that is going to enhance your cultural diversity experience? out of those three things? Are you going to look at your people structure? Are you going to look at your systems to see whether they're in place, or are you going to look at the culture of your organization? Because that's something that you can start on. And just like cultural change is difficult, yeah, you might not be able to get there overnight, but that doesn't mean that if the task is too difficult, we sort of leave it and say, oh, it's too hard. We can all start somewhere. And looking at your faces, I think it's time for me to end, because you started off smiling, and now I'm just seeing all these faces looking at me. But I did come here to sort of stir you, and I hope that I've given you something to certainly think about. So thank you very much.